welcome you to the Cape Town Press Club at Kelvin Grove. We welcome our Kelvin Grove guests as well, and our journalists who are present. May I just note that masks can only be removed once you're at your table, but obviously that's already happened. So, upcoming functions, we have Phil Craig, who's co-founder of the Cape Independence Advocacy Group, an organisation which promotes informed debate on whether the Western Cape should break away from South Africa and form a new sovereign state. So I imagine that both Premier Winde and the leader of the opposition will be stampeding to that function. Then Trudy Madonsela is with us again with Prof. Winde de Villiers on social justice very shortly. I'd like to note the presence of the Belgian, Colombia, German, Indian, Japanese, Netherlands, Paraguay, Portugal, Switzerland, United Kingdom, USA and Zimbabwe diplomatic corps members, high commissioners and ambassadors and so forth. I'd also like to thank Distel for sponsoring the wine at our functions, and thank Benny Rubinovitz for sponsoring the recording of this meeting. I'm Donald Presley. I have chaired this club for about 200 years, and but currently I am acting as chair today. This debate was my idea. I really wanted to have it in about 1980, but we've finally got around to it. No, jokes aside, I've been wanting to have a debate between the main parties in the Western Cape for quite some years, and we finally pulled it off. And really thank Premier Winde and the leader of the opposition, Cameron Dugmore, for agreeing to be here today. I personally have bounced back from stage 3 cancer, and that's why I'm looking so remarkably good. And I've known Premier Winde and Cameron Dugmore for many years. Cameron I have known from even university days when he was SRC president at UCT, and he came to visit the finest university in Africa, Rhodes, many years ago. Right, I've never chaired a debate before. So if I am appalling at it, just scream and shout and say I am biased or giving one of the parties too much time or failing to bring things to a halt. But what I'm going to do is give each guest 10 minutes to set out how they see the relationship between provincial and national powers, which is the topic today, obviously, and any changes they wish to propose. And then they will get a second round of 5 minutes in which to reply to the other's view. Then I will put 3 questions which I have given to both speakers already, so they've had preparation time, and then I'll open the floor to everyone here. And then we'll round up with final comments. So for the next 3 or 4 hours, we will be engaging with the 2 speakers. So if Premier Winde and leader of the opposition, Cameron, can come up and sit on either side, on the 2 end chairs, I think would be better, and then I'll sit over here. And we have 3 mics, and we will proceed from there. What I think I'll do is I'll stay here for the moment, and I will press my 10 minutes, and I'm going to be biased. I'm going to ask the speaker closest to me to start first, which is Premier Winde.
You want to speak from here or there?
You can speak from here.
Sure.
preferred standing. Welcome. I'm going to stand.
Thank you very much, Donald. It's really good to be here. Can I first of all say to the Consul Generals, Your Excellencies, the Diplomatic Corps, always good to see you at these functions. Can I say to the Leader of Opposition, Cameron Dugmore, good to be with you, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you very much, Donald, for this idea. I must say it's not the first time that this has happened. Cameron and I have shared other platforms where we've shared debates on platforms, and I think it's a great idea. I actually wish we could see more of this in our country, in other provinces, and perhaps even here at the Press Club. What about the President and the Leader of the Opposition in some debate here at the Press Club? That would be really good. So thank you very much for putting it together and putting this question to us. I would like to start off by saying that personally I absolutely believe in federalism. I believe in devolution of power closest to the people, or closer, as close as possible. And specifically in the essence or the framework of our Constitution, if the competency is there at the local government level or the provincial level, the power should also be devolved to that level. And in actual fact, what should happen then is that if there's a failing at that level, that's of course when a national government or a provincial government would step in, but try to get the power as close to the citizens as possible. I also believe that through this, a democracy and devolution of power, that's how we actually build a better South Africa. That's how we make sure that there's competitiveness in the system, or should I say co-competing in the system. So as provinces, we should be co-competing with each other to make sure that we are giving the citizens the best possible services. And of course, there's nothing has stood out more for me in how we work together, but also compete with each other in the last year. I've had this position now coming up in a month and a bit for 2 years, and the first year was sort of get our 5-year plan in place, and of course then came COVID-19 and turned everything upside down. But what definitely happened in that period was it created this environment where we could co-compete. And that's actually at the end of the day in the best interests of our country, South Africa. I also want to say that when our Constitution was put together, I wasn't there when it was happening, but 30 years ago when the process started, and so many people gave up so much of their time in forming this Constitution. Even federalism at that stage was a heated debate. And you had generally an ANC position, and then you had opposition parties, or which became opposition parties after the election, pushing for more federal powers and less federal powers, but it was a heated debate. And I think our Constitution needs to probably enable us to go further, and I'll talk a little bit about that on what I think we should be doing in pushing the boundaries a lot more, specifically where we find shortfalls or needs because our citizens are feeling the pain or feeling a shortage of delivery in that specific space. And it's always this contested environment between a centralized control and a decentralized, and of course, a democratic decentralized system. I do believe that that does give better service delivery to citizens. And that's, of course, a fundamental and a foundational aspect of a healthy democracy, where citizens have the choice at the end of the day, and political parties come with their policies and try to make the best difference that they can. For us, if I think about how we really push those boundaries, first of all, as a province, we try to compete with our other provinces in showing that we will make sure that we run a good, clean government, and we measure it through the audit outcomes. And we measure each other. We have a look at what our audit outcomes are like compared to, say, another province's audit outcomes. Or even just some of the service delivery areas or levels of what kind of services are delivered, where the shortfalls are, and which provinces are doing better than others. Or even in the economic space. And I think back now, I said to you, with COVID-19, even in that space, we were competing as provinces, but we were co-competing. We were coming together as South Africa more regularly than we've ever done before. I've had more meetings in the last year with the President probably per month than I had in the previous year per year, because we were all fighting one single pandemic. But in that space, I can tell you right now that when we as a province were pushing the boundaries on building hospitals or field hospitals, we could see and feel that we were pushing boundaries and we were actually helping, but also influencing delivery in other provinces. The latest area of pressure right now is vaccines. And there's no doubt that in our province, when our cabinet took the decision that we are going to go out and look at procuring vaccines, that we found a lot more energy into the vaccine space at a national level, because this province was starting to push those boundaries. But I think nothing stands out for me more so than policing powers. At the moment, in our country, and our constitution says that policing sits at a national level. I truly believe that policing powers should be the other way around. Provinces should have the policing powers, national should have the oversight. At the moment, I have the oversight at province, and national has the powers. When I see the province failing in policing, when we're sitting with the drastic crime levels that we've got with gangsterism, murders, gender-based violence, what should be happening if the police are not doing their job here? The national government should put us under administration and say, well, we'll step in and sort that out. At the moment, it's a national competency. It's not being sorted out. Now, I'm continually pushing for that, but at the meantime, I'm not going to just sit back and say, well, that's all we're going to do is push for that change. So what we're doing is, even within the existing constitutional framework, we're starting to push those boundaries. We've already put 500 extra sets of boots on the ground in a way that we're working with local government in putting those boots on the ground. This financial year, we've got another 250 in training now, and a further 250 coming up. We've started programs with extra canine units. We've got ambassadors safety ambassadors put into our municipalities. So we really have started to say, within the safety framework, we might think that we need a change in legislation, but at the meantime, what we're going to do is, within that existing framework, we're going to push those boundaries, claim more space. And of course, the same is in the energy field. We've started quite a while ago in energy. You would already see in the city of Cape Town many more embedded self-generation units, solar power, the city itself generating power. So you'll see already a different level of blackout happening when Eskom needs to black out the country because they don't have sufficient power. You'll already see Cape Town is on a different level. You see a different stance now looking at what we're going to be doing in other municipalities in enabling them to push those boundaries on energy. I also think that for me, this last year has also shown me, and I've learned so much about how a province can, within this constitutional framework, really start to do things differently. And for me, what's really stood out is the innovation.
1 minute.
So we now deliver medicines to people who previously used to have to queue at our clinics. We've delivered 1.2 million parcels of medicine to citizens across this province because it was less risk for them. The red dot and blue dot taxi system, getting healthcare workers to and from our hospitals. But again, we're now rolling that out into the taxi industry, how we build a safer, more reliable, more cost-effective taxi industry using incentives. And that's going to make a difference not only for us here in the province. I promise you it's going to make a difference and influence national government the way we work with it. If I think about the diabetic programs we've had on we call it the Vector program, minimizing risk during this period, world-class stuff coming out of this province. And again, as I said, really starting to push the boundaries on vaccines. We've already budgeted for vaccines ourselves as a province. We've already got a procurement team in place, again, as a province, just claiming that space and pushing those boundaries. I want to say that in transport, in rail, that is another space where, quite frankly, we need to step in as a region, as a province and the city region, put a transport authority in place. And it's not only the Western Cape that's pushing us because we might be opposition to the ANC. We are also collaborating with other provinces. So the Gauteng Premier and myself are at idem when it comes to setting up a transport authority where we actually look at how we are going to change public transport in our provinces. We've already started the work between the City of Cape Town, between Stellenbosch and Drakensberg municipalities on how we look at rail, bus, taxi, get it into an independent transport authority, and I promise you that's going to make a massive difference in public transport, in dealing with congestion, because quite frankly right now, thank you.
Right, Cameron, you have 10 minutes starting right away.
Thank you very much, Donald. The Premier has just remarked that you are worse than the Speaker in terms of your timekeeping. But ladies and gentlemen, members of the Diplomatic Corps and members of the Press Club, thank you very much for the invitation. The topic I was originally given was whether greater powers should be devolved to provinces, and that will be the focus of the first 10 minutes that we have. I believe that we have a very young democracy which is guided by a constitution which emerged after decades of a brutal system of apartheid, and I think we should also recognize the impact of colonialism on our country that was characterized by oppression and exploitation mainly based on race. And there was a struggle against that system, and what our constitution reflects is the product of a negotiated settlement which sought to avoid a civil war and establish democracy. So there were compromises made in putting the constitution together. The preamble of our constitution states that our freely elected public reps have adopted the constitution as the supreme law of the republic so as to build a united and democratic South Africa able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations. I think also a critical feature which informs this debate is that Chapter 3 lays a very strong emphasis on cooperative government, which is constituted, as we all know, at national, provincial and municipal level. And these spheres of government already, as in our constitution, are distinctive already, they are interdependent and they are interrelated. So clearly this is neither a unitary or a federal arrangement. It is a uniquely South African one. One of the principles of cooperative government and intergovernmental relations contained in Section 41 is that each sphere of government must respect the constitutional status, the institutions, the powers and functions of government in other spheres, and not assume any power or function except those conferred on them in terms of the Constitution. I would argue that the structure of government as contained in our Constitution, with its focus on the need for distinctive spheres of government, national, provincial and municipal level, clearly delineated powers and functions, and there are many powers to the provinces and municipalities, and also the legislative authority as contained in the schedules to our Constitution, an institution such as the National Council of Provinces and the various dispute resolution mechanisms which exist guiding our intergovernmental relations framework. I believe that they are adequate for now as we try and build and strengthen what is essentially a very young democracy. The ANC has always favored a strong unitary state as opposed to a federal one, given the need for reconstruction and development of the whole of our country and the need to dismantle the governance structures of the apartheid state, which had, and I think we sometimes forget this, that at its height, it used to have 18 departments of health, 14 departments of education, 14 departments of finance, and budgets spread across the tricameral and Bantustan systems. So it's been a huge struggle to simply build a state, and I think we would all argue that the capability of that state at different levels is highly questionable. I think we must acknowledge that. But simply building a democratic state at these three spheres has involved a huge amount of work, given the legacy that our democracy was left with, our government was left with. So the reality has been that those provinces which had the task of amalgamating previous Bantustan administrations with the 4 provincial administrations set up to govern white South Africa have faced the toughest challenges as they remain with the legacy of these Bantustan administrations. The Western Cape, as we all know, as well as Gauteng, did not face the same challenges. Even KwaZulu-Natal only had the task of amalgamating the old Natal provincial administration and the KwaZulu administration. There's in fact been a huge debate within the ranks of the ANC, probably from about 10 years post-democracy, about whether in fact the provinces are helping with the task of reconstruction, development and unity or not. And while no resolution has been taken on this matter by the ANC, there's been an increasing emphasis placed on the need to focus on strengthening local government as a distinctive sphere closest to the people when it comes to the service delivery. And I think that's where within the ANC the debate is focused on how we actually strengthen local government in particular. The national government's decision to introduce the district delivery model, is part of the attempt to support local government by involving national and provincial government directly in the task of economic development and service delivery across each district in that country. And on that, for instance, the Western Cape, and Premier Winde would confirm this, they support the district development model but have had a concern with the deployment of national ministers and their role in these districts. But they have been supportive of that, which is for me an illustration of how cooperation between the three spheres has potential. I believe that our focus now has to be on building a capable and developmental state across all spheres by ensuring that the process of appointments at these levels creates a professional public service where the necessary skills and experience are present. We need senior managers that are committed to rooting out corruption, nepotism and patronage wherever it takes place. The steps to strengthen national institutions such as the NPA, Prosecuting Authority, the Hawks and the SIU, the Special Investigation Unit by President Ramaphosa, so that they are able to, and indeed do, act without fear or favor, are slowly beginning to show results. Additional powers have been allocated to the Auditor General to ensure consequence management for those officials found to have been responsible for wasteful, unauthorized and fruitless expenditure. And I believe that those amendments to that legislation will assist to deal with corruption and malfeasance. Recent proposed amendments to the Municipal Systems Act will go a long way to ensuring the appointment of capable managers at municipal level. So when we consider the debate about whether there should be additional powers devolved to provinces, we need to be very clear about a few things. Firstly, which particular powers are being referred to? So when the Premier talks about policing powers, what is he actually saying? Which particular powers? It's, very often these become election slogans on a poster, more policing powers. But in fact, if you look at the current Police Act, you look at the Constitution, the role of the province in appointing a provincial commissioner, those arguing for more powers need to be specific. Secondly, would the proposed devolution require a constitutional amendment or not? I would argue that many of the issues that need to be addressed can be addressed through legislation, but those that would require constitutional amendment, that's 2/3. And are we in a position to do that in terms of the particular issue we're proposing? And then finally, are there other ways to deal with the perceived need for powers to be devolved and rectify the weakness leading to that situation? For instance, if we look at what is already available to provinces, in terms of Section 104(6) of our Constitution, a provincial legislature may recommend to the National Assembly legislation concerning any matter outside the authority of that legislature. As far as I know, since 1994, not once has the Western Cape legislature approached the National Assembly to amend any particular legislation. So here you have a power that is included in our Constitution which has never been used, and it's easier for people to put up a slogan as opposed to actually be practical about what legislation, what amendments, and I think that is required if we're asking for more powers. This debate, as I've said, often emerges before elections, where we find some seeking independence for the Western Cape, as we believe, or promising greater powers to the province. These are often simply pipe dreams. I think the issue of the Western Cape becoming a separate country is one of those, totally unrealistic and are made without serious consideration. So thus, all we see about additional police powers at this point in time are manifesto posters from the DA, not practical proposals. They are not considered arguments brought by the executive in our province, in the provincial cabinet, to the legislature. And I think we need to be specific. It is clear from our perspective as the ANC that when, as we have now, the DA faces electoral threats from the right, whether it's the Freedom Front, who are competing for the same constituency, or whether it's secessionist parties here in the Western Cape, that this will then no doubt see the DA haul out their federalist credentials before the 2021 local elections. But in fact, and I don't know how many people are aware of the fact that I left it there, there's a provincial constitution which creates two very independent institutions which exist nowhere else in South Africa: Children's Commissioner and an Environmental Commissioner. Premier Zille took 10 years to actually implement the Children's Commissioner, because we believe that at that point she feared the focus that there would be. Right now, Premier Winde and his cabinet are focused on removing the provision from the provincial constitution providing for an environmental commissioner. And if you look at the provision of the Western Cape Constitution, it says these should be implemented without delay. So here we have a so-called federal party arguing against two independent institutions in the Western Cape. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we now go to the second round. I'll start again with the Premier, and then when I put the questions, I'll start with the Leader of the Opposition. Each contestant, each participant has 5 minutes to reply to the other's view. So we start off with Premier Winde responding to camera.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this second opportunity. I think first of all, just reflecting on a couple of the points as raised by the Honourable Dugmore, the Leader of the Opposition, I want to say first of all that in his couching of what our different powers are, and that we must not assume powers that are not assigned to us, and I absolutely disagree with it. Because remember that our Constitution and the planning started 31 years ago actually, in designing this government that we've got today. Think about that was before smartphones, before the kind of tech and innovation age that we've got today. We need to review, we need to continually test and check. So I totally disagree with that, especially in the areas of energy, rail, bulk water supply, policing, as I've said, forestry and fishing. I mean, it should definitely be devolved to those provinces with forestry, or specifically those coastal provinces with oceans, so that you deal with those exact issues that are pertinent to your specific province. I also want to say that with regards to your points made on legislation and the ability of provinces to make their own legislation, you will know, because you've been in the legislature when of course, the Community Safety Act was passed, which was our own legislation that created the space for setting up an ombudsman. Because also, according to the Constitution, we have an oversight role of policing in the province, so we then expanded our ability to have oversight, so we set up the office of the ombudsman. We also put the Education Act in place, which then also helps us with the independent body that has the oversight over our schools. Because we made a few mistakes early on when we put our constitution together, when we formed this new democracy of ours. I think of one was definitely the power of the unions and pushing inspectorates out of our education system. And I think we as South Africans have definitely suffered because of that. And so we've passed that piece of legislation that actually enables that independent oversight. Perhaps talking about the Children's Commissioner and the Environmental Commissioner. Interesting that it took Helen Zille 10 years to put the Children's Commissioner in place, but of course the ANC was also in power prior to the DA, and I didn't see them put either of those two offices in place. And quite frankly, if we look at the argument that the Honourable Esop gave when she was the Minister of Environmental Affairs, you could actually read out that exact same argument, because when the Constitution was written, and where we are today, we have got world-class legislation in place on managing the environment. And so it really doesn't make any sense in spending millions and millions more to set up this office when it's not necessary. We've got the right regulation and the legislation in place. So that's why we are saying, in this case, that should actually be removed from our Constitution. But it's going out for public comment, and of course we will ask the citizens of this province to also engage in that space. I also want to say that perhaps just a comment on the district development model, and of course we do support it in principle, but we also have a different view of how the district development model should be enacted. Because in our districts, it should not be about management and control, and that was the point that Cameron raised about our dispute as to what is the role of a national minister assigned to a district. What powers do they have? Is this national coming in to tell that district how to run the district? And we don't believe in that at all. We've asked the question, asked the president, please tell us what are the powers of these ministers you're assigning? And of course then we saw a reversal of those ministers being deployed. But we do believe that there needs to be coordination and joint planning. And that's how you work with the districts. And that's how we worked in the last year. We've been so much more connected than we've ever been before. In the first start of this pandemic, we met 3 times a week as a cabinet, top management, the police, the military. We met with all of our district municipalities and mayors 3 times a week. Then we moved on as we got to understand this pandemic a bit better, and we came together every single week. Tomorrow, again, we have a cabinet meeting, but the first part of that cabinet meeting doesn't just include the Western Cape government. It includes the municipal managers and the mayors of each of the districts of our province. Coordination. So we are joint planning.
Right, we now move on to Cameron for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Donald. I think the first response that the Premier gave actually underlines the point I'm trying to make. He talked about the legislation that they've passed, about the police ombud in the province, education laws. That is exactly the point. The Constitution allows that to happen. And that is exactly, so I repeat, and we still haven't heard it from the Premier, what additional powers do you want? That's really the question. Because it's correct, this Constitution in terms of the schedules makes basic education, for instance, both a national and a provincial competence, but essentially the provinces, in terms that's a legislative competence, so the province is allowed to make law. So that provincial education law has been made, the law on the ombud has been made. So the Constitution allows provinces to do that. So I'm actually asking, and I think that's the issue, the topic of this debate is whether additional powers should be allocated to provinces. What other powers do you actually want? I think that's the issue. We don't want an election poster saying more police powers. We want to say exactly which powers, because if you look at the Police Act, if you look at the Constitution, for instance, the appointment of a provincial police commissioner, that cannot be done by the National Police Commissioner. There has to be a process where the provincial cabinet actually emerges, is involved in an interview process. Only if there's a dispute can the National Commissioner get involved. And even then, that is just to mediate. It's not to make a decision. And the Premier is aware of that. So I would say that if we had to look at an issue which the Premier has raised about a metropolitan rail authority, I think that's a very practical thing to look at. We as the ANC, in terms of draft policy, have looked at what a metropolitan transport authority, in terms of rail, buses, taxis, what such an authority could do to have an integrated ticketing system, and we are broadly supportive of that. Obviously, there's a whole lot of steps, but I would argue, if you actually look at it and you look at the competencies, do you need to devolve any more powers to actually do that, or is it a question of developing a consensus and defining the roles of local government in that, of provincial government and the national government? So I think through a cooperative approach, the establishment and working towards a metropolitan transport authority is something that should be engaged about. Just on the issue of the police, there was a very interesting article written by the Social Justice Coalition and the headline of that, it's written by Dali Veyers and Justin Jafter in June of 2019. And they make the argument that provincial policing is a recipe for disaster. And one of the things that they raise there is that you already have a situation, and we know the problems that beset the police at different levels. So if you allow another level of government to essentially get involved in the processes of setting up a different police force, because when the Premier argues we need more policing functions, I think the real debate should be, if we're going to be serious, which particular powers. We have a municipal police, which is allowed in terms of the constitution and this, but when former Premier Helen Zille appointed the Khayelitsha Commission, and communities asked that commission's term of reference should also include the role of the municipal police, and the particular unit, the anti-land invasion unit, should be part of that. The Premier simply excluded that. She said, let's only look at the South African police, which I think was wrong, because the city police in themselves, there's been a number of issues which have emerged in regard to standards and so on. So I would argue that we to create different provincial police services at this point in time of our country's history would actually, and I agree with the writers of this article, would be a recipe for disaster, because it literally creates different centers of power, different standards, and in terms of actually where we are now as a country, I don't think it would be useful. We need to increase monitoring powers which are there in the Constitution. We need to support an institution such as the Police Ombudsman in the Western Cape. But if devolution means handing over the entire police function to a province, let's get the detail. What is informing that? So I think that the arguments around federalism and devolution of powers have in a way become issues that emerge at election time because of certain challenges that electoral parties face mainly from their right. And what we need to get into is a substantive assessment of where we are, and as I'd argued before, a real focus on strengthening particularly the local sphere of government, because that is really where we face a number of weaknesses, and we need to focus on that. We would never want to contest, and this is what the Premier had argued in regard to the achievement of clean audits. That is something that needs to be applauded. But as we need clean audits, we also need to make sure that delivery actually changes the lives in terms of the economy and issues of land ownership, because that's what is needed as well, in addition to simply clean audits. Thanks.
Right, thank you for a very calm debate. I'm going to now move on to my questions. Some of these issues have been raised in the debate, but I think a greater focus is good. The powers over policing are largely held by national government over the South African police services. And should greater powers be devolved to the provincial level over provincial police and indeed municipal police? I've just added municipal police there, if I may. We'll start with Cameron this time for 2 minutes.
Thanks, Donald. I think I did make our position clear that in regard to the South African police, we believe that needs to remain a national competence, but we also need to understand what the national constitution as well as the South African Police Act allows provinces to do. And as you've indicated on the municipal police, there's a clear provision in the Police Act which allows for the establishment of municipal police. I think one of the gaps on municipal police is where is the level of accountability in regard to abuse of powers by municipal police, which I think is a clear gap that needs to be looked at. But the province at this point in time has a direct say and a persuasive say in the appointment of a provincial commissioner for that province. In fact, it is able to institute processes which can lead to the dismissal of a provincial commissioner. That's in the Constitution. So the argument for me is that it's too soon in our democracy, given the overall challenges that we've had in integrating Bantustan police and different police services, different security services, and that we need to strengthen the South African police, let the provinces play their role in terms of monitoring community police relations, and sort out a way of accountability for our municipal police. But at the moment, we believe those changes can be made without giving additional powers to the provinces. Thanks.
Okay, you beat your 2 minute lineup.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that question. and I know we have been speaking about this, but I want to first of all say that with regard to policing in the province, I mean, we already know we're about 4,000 police too few in the province to get the equilibrium of deployment of police to population. But quite frankly, we have some of the highest murder rates per capita in South Africa. It shouldn't be just equilibrium, it should have more deployment. And that's why we're saying it shouldn't just be power over the police. We should have deployment of, we should have the budget and the opportunity to deploy police and manage them from a provincial level. And in actual fact, the problem that we have at the moment is at the national level, they are actually posing a process of centralizing all police powers under a national level, even municipal police now to be centralized under a national level. I think that will be an absolute disaster because we can see the deployment already doesn't work. On the appointment of the police commissioner, you are partially correct. We are allowed to have a seat on the interview panel, so the national commissioner contacts me, he says to me, we will be interviewing for police commissioners, we advertise the fact, and then either myself or the MEC Fritz in this case, will have a seat on the interview panel for the national commissioner post. But I also did raise this because if you remember, before I became the Premier, I specifically asked the previous Premier, Helen Zille, if I could spend 6 months in the portfolio of community safety, because I wanted to get my head around it. I wanted to understand this portfolio of oversight and what should we be doing. We put some constitutional legal minds together and we said, what should we be doing as a province differently, changing the constitution, and in actual fact took that debate to the national minister, to Minister Becky Clele. And in the MINMEC discussions, and Minister Becky Clele, his words to me were, I'm sorry, not over my dead body will we look at changing it. And in actual fact, that's what's happening at the moment. We're seeing more work to centralization of policing, all forms of policing. So it's local law enforcement, metro police, SAPs, everybody under one central umbrella.
Right, time out. Right, we move to question 2. This question does focus on Cameron, so perhaps we'll get the Premier to respond first. Cameron Dugmore, in his capacity as ANC leader of the opposition in the Western Cape legislature, attended hearings of the Public Works Committee recently, which is considering, sorry I left this out of the question, considering the expropriation bill, which is commonly known as the expropriation without compensation bill. He welcomed the transformative expropriation, which is added to the legal environment of the bill. Obviously, the initial, the existing 1975 expropriation bill focuses on public use of to build roads and hospitals and so forth. So this expands the definition. Does this open the door to land grabs? So we ask the Premier to answer for 2 minutes first.
Thank you very much. I think first of all, I think my position on expropriation without compensation has been clear from the very beginning, that in actual fact our existing constitution allows for expropriation and processes. I believe those are fair processes. I don't believe we need to have the change, number one. Number two, I think that the impact, and we just have a look at the impact on the economy. Quite frankly, if you look at us as South Africa, the highest youth unemployment rate in the world, unemployment rate in general, one of the highest in the world. Quite frankly, we need to change policies that are causing unemployment, causing people to disinvest from our region. And this piece of legislation is doing exactly the opposite. It should be reviewed. It's not the right way to be going. But when you talk about land grabs, I'm not sure if this specifically is going to leverage a lot more land grabs. I think what's been happening at the moment, and the work that we're busy doing, trying to end the disaster declaration, because we at the moment managing COVID-19 are managing it under a central disaster declaration, and I think that is causing land grabs. That when the courts are actually supporting people who have illegally occupied land. I know that in the last year it's been very difficult. A number of court cases in the city of Cape Town alone, 65,000 through court processes illegal shacks have been removed. But how many have not been removed because of this loophole in the system, because this disaster declaration is in place? We need to change it. It is causing a major, major disruption to all of our local governments, and I don't have to even just say for the city of Cape Town. Let's just have a look at what's happening in the city of Joburg or in Gauteng. You see exactly the same things, and we need to change these frameworks that are actually causing land grabs even more so than the debate around expropriation.
Right, Cameron.
Thanks, Donald. Just to put it on the record that the ANC is totally against any form of a land grab. There's a big difference between the African National Congress and the EFF. We're against that. I think everything that is being discussed, and just to correct you, Donald, I made a presentation at the Public Works Portfolio Committee that's dealing with the expropriation bill, not the Section 25.
Yeah.
But essentially, I think the point that you were making is compared to the old Expropriation Act, it would really only allow expropriation, which they refer to now in the for a public purpose. Like if you need a road, you need to build a school, it's sort of a more limited definition. Whereas what the new expropriation bill does, it also provides for expropriation in the public interest, and that's the shift, because the public interest is defined as the nation's commitment to land reform and to reforms to bring about equitable access to all South Africa's natural resources. So compared to the old expropriation bill or the act, this implies both for public purpose and for public interest. And I would argue that the best way to avoid land grabs is for us to have detailed audits at every municipality, to have a land release plan, which the City of Cape Town, I would argue, has failed to do, where you actually put out, this is national government land, and we have a lot of that in the City of Cape Town. This is provincial government land, this is municipal land, this is parastatal land, this is well-located private property that we might consider for expropriation. I want to say very clearly, the conditions under which expropriation will happen without compensation are very clearly defined. And it was at our national conference, I was there to say that such expropriation without compensation shouldn't affect the agricultural economy, food security, as well as national investment. So this notion that people have that every time an expropriation will happen in the future, it's going to happen without compensation is simply not correct. There are clearly defined circumstances. If we don't correct this original sin, the sin, as the President talks of dispossession, this country faces huge amounts of instability and trauma. There's a way for us to do it, and that is to be proactive, to have a land release program, and to expropriate where necessary and needed. Thank you.
Thank you. My last question before we go to the floor is powers over education are shared between provinces and national level, as far as I understand it. That national government more or less calls the shots, certainly in terms of curriculum and key elements. And as we have a Premier and a former MEC for education, I thought this was a pertinent question. Is there room for greater devolution of education powers to the provinces or even to a lower level? Should we start with the Premier this time? It's Cameron. Cameron was last time, so okay.
I think
Cameron.
The Constitution is clear that tertiary education and further education is a national competence, and basic education is a legislative competence shared, but the practical implementation of health, education and social development is with the provinces. I think that's very clear. So the Premier remarked earlier that when there's a need for intervention, when a province is failing, that is also something which our Constitution would provide. And I would argue that the fact that there are 5,000 children in this province not yet in school is a clear case for national intervention. That's why we as the ANC have complained to the Human Rights Commission. And in fact, when it comes to issues of funding, there's an equitable share allocated by the Finance and Fiscal Commission, which doesn't discriminate against provinces based on poverty weighting. So I would argue that we need to get our basic education right as a province. Learners have to be in school. If you look at the fact that our matric results, we are down at 3, that we are the lowest in the country when it comes to matrics signing up for physical science, there are huge challenges that we face. And this would, for instance, be an example without changing anything, the national could intervene like they've done in some other provinces with certain departments. I simply think that it's unacceptable that this far into the school year, over 5,000 of our learners are not in province. And maybe this is a case where the national does actually have to intervene.
Right, to beat the deadline there. Premier?
Thank you very much. I suppose I better start with that then, rather than the question, and say I absolutely agree that we need to place all of our learners into education spaces that they can get the opportunity that they need to play part in a positive part in our society. But we must also understand the numbers, and we must understand the facts. So if you looked at the numbers of students expected this year in August last year, 29,000 extra students arriving in our province looking for learning and looking for school spaces or placement. In January it was 19,000, and so every week it's come down. It was 5,000 last week, it's now 4,142. And maybe I must also just say one other point about placement and the difference between Gauteng placement and the Western Cape placement. Until the student is placed, they will stay on the list until they are placed. In Gauteng, if they say to you, you're on the list, here's your position, here's your placement, you are placed at a school 48 kilometers away from where you live, that's your space. If you don't take it up, you come off the list anyway. We don't take them off the list, they remain on the list. Because I agree, we've got to get every single learner placed. But quite frankly, learners are coming to this province from other provinces, as they are going to Gauteng from failed provinces where education is not happening. In one district council and one district area in the Eastern Cape, there are 27 schools that are empty. No learners in them. But I bet you the division of revenue is still delayed because the teachers are still being paid in those provinces. We have to find that extra money in this province to place everyone in. But I agree, and we are working day and night to make sure that we place every single one of those students. And in actual fact, we need to have them all placed within the next few weeks. The next term, we can't have students not placed in. And then I think more or less powers. I mean, I think this is one area where we do share those powers between national and province. The one area is curriculum. What we are doing is pushing the boundaries. So everyone always focuses on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths. But we've changed that to STEMAC. We've added in arts, agriculture, and then coding. We need to be able to be producing the right skills for the economy. And I think, quite frankly, there is a lot of work that we need to do.
Thank you for keeping to the time limits. We now open to the floor. And I see Professor Butler right here, and our sound man is going to hurtle over with the mic. Professor Butler from UCT.
Thank you very much. I wanted to try to get you to focus on the question, which was about provincial powers rather than Western Cape provincial powers only. And we have two provinces that more or less work, Western Cape and Gauteng. And we have 7 provinces that don't really work. So the question of whether provinces get more powers isn't about just the ones that work. It's also about the ones that don't work. And Alan mentioned some of the parallels between Gauteng and Western Cape in education. And we heard about also some of the problems with provinces that have former Pakistan police services integrated, as we don't think Western Cape. So, 2 questions. One of them is, in practical terms, can we conceive of a bit of jargon of asymmetric federalism, in which some provinces get more powers than others? So which would the provinces be, and how would those powers be accessed and allocated? And the second question is political, really. The only way this could happen would be if an ANC province, Gauteng, initially partnered with Western Cape to lobby and argue for such an asymmetric federalism. Are either of those 2 realistic prospects?
Thank you, Professor. We'll start with the Premier.
Thank you very much.
1 minute.
Thank you very much. And absolutely, I think that's exactly what we need. Because what we need to do is, when the competency is there, you devolve the power. If the competency is not giving effect to that power, then you withdraw it and you bring it back to a national level. In other words, in the policing example, that we would have the power, the budgets, the policing, but if we're not bringing down crime, well, then what you do is you then intervene from a national level. And I think the same goes for your second part of the question, is how do we work together? So without betraying too many confidences, I mean, that's exactly what I started to do from day one when I got this job. How do I build relationships with other provinces? So for example, and I mean, this one I can say, the immediate partner was Gauteng. I've already said that we have the same ideas around devolution of rail power. Initially, I think the first PCF, that's the Premier's Coordinating Forum, where all of the mayors and the municipal managers are together. The DG in our province invited the DG from Gauteng, please come and join us. We've built a great relationship over time working with those provinces. The same thing in COVID-19.
Ignore him.
I'd phone other premiers before meeting with the president on a Sunday. What are we going to do as a province? How do we tackle this together? You have to do that. Thank you.
Cameron?
Yeah. No, I'm glad that Professor Butler has raised the issue of we're dealing with 9 provinces here. Because often this debate is phrased in terms of devolving powers to provinces with a plural. We're not specifically, so if you're changing the constitution, that generally has an effect on all the provinces. And it's a very real issue. I mentioned the debate in the ANC. The debate in the ANC is exactly about that, the weakness and dysfunctionality, quite honestly, of some of the departments. Look at the intervention in the Northwest and so on. So I want to use an example like in the Housing Act, and I think I'm right on this. There's a provision in the national housing legislation which allows, Premier, I think you'll agree with me on this, for a municipality to take the functions for housing from a province, right? And it has to meet certain criteria. So maybe one is able to do this kind of thing through national legislation which allows certain competencies which are currently not there to be done by a municipality or a province. So I think that is definitely positive. And then just to say, I mean, I mentioned, and I don't think I'm sticking my neck out here, that on the Metropolitan Transport Authority issue, we know that Gauteng is similar to the province in needing issues of mobility, single ticketing systems. So I think that's something that really needs to be talked about. And quite honestly, I don't think it requires a constitutional change. It needs a legislative change. And I would argue, and I think I saw former MEC Donald Grant, I think he would remember from his days in transport that I had referred some people to him who had wanted to look at the connectivity between the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape in regard to rail. So almost having a rail that would go via Beaufort West and be able to arrive in the Eastern Cape on a Friday. People who have things to do there would do them and then come back, over the weekend. That would do a huge amount for saving lives on roads, etc., etc. So those cooperations between provinces, I think, are possible and should be explored further. So you've come up with a term for asymmetrical federalism, and whether we name it that or not, I think if there's a will to do something, one can do a lot through legislation and providing conditions or criteria for certain functions to be done in different spheres of government.
Okay, I gave you a bit extra time there. Professor Collins I saw, and I saw some hands over there, but let's go to Professor Collins in the middle there.
Yes, thank you very much, all three of you. It does seem to me that the elephant in this room is money. And what I would like to know is how the two of you differ, if at all, on the questions: who can raise what taxes, spend them on what projects, to whom they are accountable for their spending, and how much is all this going to cost me as a taxpayer?
Okay, we'll start with Cameron, I think, is the next one in the lineup.
Yeah. I think that you might be aware of the fact that in addition to your pocket being hit by the payments owing by yourself, income tax, and then your municipal rates and services, one of the provincial taxes that you currently pay is when you get your motor vehicle license. And if you're a gambler, some of the money that you gamble, there's a casino tax that goes to the province. The province does have the right to raise loans. And I know that when we governed the province, we were looking at various options, such as if you look at the tourism levy, possibly looking at increasing the tourism levy that would go to actually advancing and boosting. I'm not aware, Premier, whether your government has made any additional proposals, but any proposals for loans, additional revenues, there has to be a massive consultation process. And I think at the end of the day, if the citizen like yourself feels that you go and stay at a hotel and you pay slightly more and that's going to go to the province to help boost tourism, you would vote with your feet, indicate clearly what you feel or what you don't feel. But in addition to any other provincial taxes that would be imposed, those would have to be widely consulted and approved. And there's a huge process in the Constitution. It's not impossible, but there are clear guidelines given the huge impact that might have on the national economy, given the fact that we have such massive increases that we face. I'm not only talking, I'm talking also about petrol and so on. So what I'm saying is it's possible to do it, but there has to be a massive consultation process. And I had once, when I was MEC for Education, had argued that like we had a transition levy, which was a one-off tax to pay for the transition, the first elections, given the inequalities of education infrastructure, I had proposed a one-off education levy. And I think a lot of South Africans, if they knew that the way that levy would be administered, wouldn't have a problem with that. There's been huge debates about, taxes, restoration taxes, and so on. So, to cut a long story short, it's possible, but one has to be very, very careful and be transparent so someone like you or anyone else knows exactly what the effect would be and whether you would support that in the interest of your city or your province.
Good. Premier?
Thank you very much. Obviously the elephant in the room is whether a political party is prepared to raise extra taxes or push them up. And in South Africa, our tax rates are far too high already. We have far too few taxpayers carrying the burden of our country. We need to be growing our economy and growing our number of taxpayers. At the moment, as a province, our own revenue generation is 5% of our revenue. And that's from, as Cameron says, from vehicle taxes or from gambling taxes. It's a very, very small percentage. The only other way that some work has been done, both during the ANC's time and our time, is whether we have a fuel levy as an extra levy in the province. But we've never enacted it. The first time that the work was done, at the same time they actually enacted a national fuel levy, so it was pointless putting one on top of the other. I have been on record to say I'll be very much in favor of saying if we do away with, say, that round disc that goes on your windscreen, because quite frankly, that's a tax as well. You've got a registration on the front of your car, and you've got this round disc on your windscreen that you renew every year. What's the purpose of that round disc? Well, it's 1.3 billion into the provincial coffers. It costs us nearly 400 million to collect that 1.3 billion. It's a very expensive tax for having a round disc on your windscreen. In actual fact, you've got that number plate. So I would do away with that, but then I would put the 1.3 billion into a fuel levy. It's much easier to collect. It's much cheaper to collect. We'd have more revenue to put into education. But of course, it is a small amount. On the other point around the tourism tax, obviously that is a voluntary levy. It's not actually a full-blown tax. It's a voluntary bed levy that the industry put on. I do believe that should probably come to the province and not go to national for disbursement. Because to the province, I think we could probably do better marketing with that money. And then we are engaging at the moment on borrowing, not further taxes, but on borrowing. Should we be borrowing right now for infrastructure investment? In other words, should we borrow now to put extra energy resources into our region or water sustainability? And I believe that if it's borrowing for investment into growing your economy, that's what we should be doing as a province.
Right, thank you. Is there a question on this side? Is there one around there? Oh, right. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, gentlemen. My name is Sebastian Messerschmidt. I'm the Consul General for the Netherlands. And I think I speak on behalf of the diplomatic community, the diplomatic corps here, that we are here to seek opportunities to make the ties between our countries as as strong as possible. And one of the areas where we want to do that is to see whether we can build on our earning capacity and creating jobs back home while doing the same thing here, looking for win-win opportunities where we know that we can benefit both South Africa and our own societies, one by doing business. So as I'm listening to your discussions about provincial powers and national powers and how it should be yes or not devolved, how would you say that the current situation or your preferred situation would actually impact on the international relations that we have with us and our ability to work with you to create that economic cooperation that we both need to better improve our lives and our citizens on both ends of the spectrum?
Right, who do we start off with this time? I've forgotten who was started last time, so we start with Cameron.
I personally can't see that in terms of the debate that we're having, that it would have a fundamental impact. I mean, for instance, our province, the fact that all of you are here, okay, it happens to be that many of the consul generals are based in Cape Town, have a relationship with the provincial government, as I'm sure you have relationships with other provincial governments. Even this province, I know that in the time that we govern, and I think those have definitely been maintained, have relationships with certain provinces in other countries, like with Shandong in China, and I think there's a Bavaria one in Germany, and possibly a few others. So I personally, I mean, the clause from the Constitution which I read out talks about taking our place as a sovereign state. So clearly the South African state, the ambassadors are received by the president and agreed to and so on. So there is that, but I think what the practical experience is that you have relationships with provincial governments and even with local governments where different countries through their cities form relationships with our cities and so on. I know there was one of Culemborg in Verleersdorp, for example, some years ago, assistance on a housing project and so on. So I personally think in terms of this whole debate that we've been having about, unless you literally, and I don't want to undermine the secessionists, but I actually think that those that want secession in the Western Cape, maybe they would then have a Western Cape ambassador to the Netherlands, but I actually don't think it's going to happen.
Right, Premier.
Thank you very much, and again, CG Messersmith, thank you very much, and to all the consul generals, to the dean of the consulate corps, we are blessed in our province to have consulates and more consulates opening, fully fledged consulates opening. It's a blessing for us. It's something that Westro works very hard with, building those relationships of trade, investment, tourism, because it's a key driver of our economy. We at the moment in the tourism space, and of course that's where a lot of work we've got to do to claw back those jobs, but it is this relationship that we have. I agree with Cameron in the area of dealing with international relations. I think as a province, we've gone out, we've got our own department, we've got our own head in international relations, and then we go out and we do our thing as a province. We build relationships, we build partnerships, we have our trade missions, we have inward trade missions, and it's all about us working hard to grow our economy. And in the last year, for me, the most amazing thing was the last year, our agricultural economy grew by 18% in the Western Cape during COVID-19. That blew my mind. While we've got the opposite happening in the tourism industry, etc. But it's because we have these great relations with international trade, with partners from around the world. That enables our businesses to attract those investments and to grow their trade and tourism.
Thank you. There's a question there at the back. Is our sound man lurking? Yes, there he is. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Michael Reyes. Premier Winde, you left out another, to my mind, element in the room in that you neglected to mention the effect of the ANC's racial legislation on the delivery of services to the province. It seems, apart from my being aware that I now have the same racial classification that I had under the apartheid government, it seems that since the introduction of the Employment Equity Act and the follow-on BE legislation, that the economy and the civil service have become riddled with affirmative action appointees of inadequate ability. There are far too many useless corporate employees, And on top of it, we have the racist corruption, the squandering of resources through the racist corruption of the BEE and all its attendant procurement processes. This obviously has some negative impact on the administration of the Western Cape, though probably, I don't know, the same case as the rest of the country. In your dealings with central government, do you see any awareness of the harm that this has done to the nation? And on top of it, would you, if you were asking the government for increased powers, would you ask for an exemption for the Western Cape from the ANC's racist legislation?
Right, we'll start with the Premier as it's directed at him.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for that question. Last night, I was in a political policy discussion until about 8:30 last night on specifically this aspect, because as a party in our last Congress, we've now said that in actual fact, race classification in redress is problematic. I mean, let alone what you've been sketching. But in our processes of redress, it is not about a piece of legislation that in actual fact has totally failed, made a few people really, really wealthy, and has actually not made that redress that it was intended to right at the beginning. And whether it's this piece of legislation or any other failed legislation that hasn't made the difference 27 years later, that's been the point about how do we review and how do we as a country take a review of those policies, whether it's expropriation without compensation or some of the BEE legislation, which hasn't made the difference. In actual fact, all it's done is cost a lot more money to the economy and not delivered the results. We need to change it. Of course, as a province, trying to change a policy within a framework of a law, we still have to abide by the laws of the country. I do believe in the rule of law and the Constitution. So we have to obviously petition, and so I would say to you the simple answer is yes. It is a raft of various policies that we need to be able to challenge and change.
Cameron?
No, thanks. No, I actually find it quite offensive when an impression is created that all corruption or all malfeasance comes from black people, because that's essentially the gentleman's comment. That's actually what he's saying, and I find that offensive. If you look at the Western Cape, we have a situation where white South Africans own 70% of all urban land, while coloured South Africans own 10%, Indians 8%, Africans 3%. Now, when you look at a figure like that and you want to remove race from the equation, you are simply deepening the conflict in this country and preserving privileges which have accrued to one race in this country by a deliberate system over decades, colonialism and apartheid. And I want to be very, very clear that from the ANC point of view, the need to build a representative but capable, and I'll grant that there are cases where the issue of nepotism has impacted, but I repeat, please don't imply that happens only in black administration or only with black officials. Secondly, employment equity has greatly assisted in developing talent in this country compared to the number of students we have, the number of women. If you look at one of the leading companies in South Africa announcing a number of black African women in terms of senior management positions, that would never have happened unless we had employment equity legislation. You cannot have a minority in this country being completely underrepresented. In this Western Cape government, there are 4 black Africans out of 76 senior managers. That is simply unsustainable and it cannot work. We have to make sure that every public servant, black or white, qualifies, is able to do that. And I'm convinced we have enough talent, and attempts to label the issue of corruption as a black thing. When you look at the corruption in the private sector, a lot of the evidence that is coming out of the Zondo Commission, that is not limited to black people. I think it's very obvious.
Right, thank you. I think I'm going to stop questions now, unless there's some pressing question. There is one, Patrick. Okay, we'll take another 2. Is that okay with both speakers? We can carry on for a while. Patrick van Black.
Thank you all. Patrick from Winde and Cape Town, West Cape. Gentlemen, I'd like to ask you a question about homelessness. It sounds less exciting than the other topics we've been talking about. And I know it's global and I know it's national, but it's become very, very obvious that there's an explosion of homelessness in Cape Town and the Western Cape. What I would like to suggest is that this is part and parcel of an increase in crime for very obvious reasons. And I wanted to know from both of you, is there any kind of strategy, a positive, productive strategy to handle something as difficult as homelessness? Thank you.
Should we start with Cameron?
Thank you. I think that's an excellent question, and I would need to concede that an integrated approach to that issue is lacking, because clearly you need to be very clear about the subsidies available to the homeless from social development. The municipalities do have a function in terms of actually creating shelters, but they argue at times that it's an unfunded mandate. And I do think that what we saw during the lockdown with the way different municipalities handled it is just an indication of what we need, which is proper norms and standards, clear mandates and financing clarity around the issue of homelessness. Obviously there's a broader issue of urbanization, needing to look at different forms of accommodation, but on dealing with the practical issue that municipalities are faced with, I think the failing at the moment is that we do not have an integrated strategy involving all spheres, and that's work that we have to do. That's all I can say. It's actually an area that has been neglected.
Right, Premier.
Thank you very much. I agree with you absolutely. It is a global issue and it is a Cape Town issue right now. It is being exacerbated and driven because of the increased unemployment that happened around COVID-19. But also, I mean, as I said earlier, I think the regulations have also it's been much more difficult to deal with it. And of course, because there's more people, it's harder to deal with. Last year, an extra 130 million rand was put towards trying to find solutions for homeless people. I know that over 1,000 extra shelter beds have been put in place. And the interesting thing for me is we've got to, and I spoke to Minister Fernandes the other day to say we need to actually come at this from a different angle. We need to put different think tanks together to say what are the solutions. Because I've just spoken about the extra beds that have been put in place in shelters. And I mean, they are government funded, and there are also NGOs that are putting shelters in place. But in the last report that I saw from the city of Cape Town, it's not as if there's insufficient beds. There are more than enough beds, but not all the beds are taken up. And we need to have a debate and a discussion on how we actually deal with this, because I agree with you, it is something that is influencing crime. There are a whole lot of other risks ahead for us if we're going to have this piece of disaster declaration in place for another year. It is going to be something that I don't know if we're going to be able to manage if it gets sort of beyond a tipping point. It's probably very close to that now. And we need to have a think tank where we bring our universities together, where we bring citizens together, where we bring the NGO sector together that are doing and offering a great service, and we actually start engaging also with the homeless citizens and saying to them, you know, what is it that we should be doing differently so we can actually find solution. It is a big conundrum.
Right, the last question somewhere over there. Could you introduce yourself, please? Have you got the mic? The mic is coming up behind you.
And I'm sorry, I'm being very assertive, but I think it's 3 key areas I want to touch on. One, of course, the homelessness. The many of them cannot afford their 25 or 30 million to pay. I think one of the strategies that should be applied is that they pay even a 5 rand to sleep at the shelters. Make it possible for them to be able to sleep over and to create that safety. The other thing is there has been a surface of gangsterism and killings. I mean, my neighbor next door, his brother was gunned down on Monday, 21 shots. On his way to work, very early in the morning, being out, not involved with gangsterism or drugs. Then there was unposted on a friend of mine with 2 little children, 6 and 4, and they planted this aloe plant in another block where their mother was gunned down by gangsters. Now, there's been a lot. There's also been the taxi chief that has been assassinated. These things have got to come to some kind of
Resolution.
It must come down. We've got to start feeling the people in those areas must start feeling a little bit of their safety, which is totally out of, it's not there. And then the third thing is that somebody wanted to touch on the transporting in terms of building the rail instead of getting people off the roads. In South Africa, I did a paper in 2001 as part of my master's. South Africans travel. They are like tourists. When I couldn't fly anymore to the Eastern Cape because of my work, done in terms of the Zuma era with the airplanes and tripled in price, I go back to traveling my bus to Queenstown. You have families, mothers, children, aunties, uncles, all on the bus. They travel. And I think in South Africa we've not looked at South Africans as those tourists, making things available at a cost-effective rate and building internally the ability of income from our locals. But safety, it wasn't safe on those buses. It always broke down, we always lost so many hours on the road. So the flying always at the end was better for us. We have to fly to East London and travel, pick up the car and travel through to Queenstown, to the villages. So I would like to see an integrated approach in terms of the provinces working together on South Africans as the tourists of their own country, because many of us have just not been able to experience it. Thank you.
Thank you. Premier first.
So I'm going to start with the last point about how do South Africans get to experience their country differently, and I must say that right now is that opportunity. And if I have a look at how the various provincial and city and municipal marketing agencies are going to work, and also how the sector themselves are changing their pricing structures, etc., because to survive the next year, they've got to do that. And I think now is the opportunity, and hopefully we do start to see a massive change that enables South Africans. But of course, it's not that easy, because so many South Africans themselves are much poorer today than they were a year ago and 10 years ago. But also that link to trains, it really drives me crazy, where at the moment, our trains aren't even running. And it really, that should be the backbone of any transport system. And it's not rocket science. It happens efficiently, cost-effectively, and safely all around the world every single day. It should be here as well. With regards to the gangs and the safety, we've had a lot of discussion around policing. In our province, that's what the safety plan is about. It's about the whole of government. So it's the education department, it's the health department. The health department, it's ECDs, it's youth at risk. It's making sure that we get to the causalities, the value system of society. If we don't start affecting through education value change in society, how are we going to correct crime in the long run? So it's getting to the why at the same time as the discussion on policing, extra boots on the ground, making sure that we are trying to make this a safer place, because crime, unfortunately, is that big thing. That's why under my campaign and since I've been in office, there's been a lot of focus to make sure that we are doing whatever we can to add to the mix of making sure it's a safer place. And then, your point about a £5 or easier entry, that must be part of that team that looks at homelessness. As far as I understand, and I'm not a specialist in this field, a big issue is because the shelters don't allow drugs or alcohol. And that is something that's a big question. We've got to ask ourselves that question: is how do we deal with it when it's the space that is not inviting enough for people to actually go and utilize that space?
Cameron?
Thank you very much for those comments and suggestions. I agree we need an integrated approach to the issue of the homeless, and particularly the funding issue, because generally at the moment it's social development and the local municipality. But I think your proposal that the homeless have a place to go to and actually contribute something is a very good one. And I think that would support, because many of the homeless are trying to make ends meet by whether they're selling certain items or asking for money and so on. So using some of that to fund themselves in getting access to a shelter, I think is a good idea. But what's absolutely critical is, what does social development then do with each of the homeless people? How do they link them up to possible family members? How do they help them with skills? So, because we don't want a situation where it's a permanent one. But I think the idea of people contributing to a shelter is an excellent one. I think for me, one of if you look at the pathologies of the Western Cape, I think the issue of alcohol abuse, drugs and gangsterism are the key pathologies which we face as a province. When I was MEC for Education, I could see that a large number of dropouts, particularly in Cape Flats and township schools, are amongst young boys, sort of grade 10, 11. That's where a huge amount of the dropouts happen, because for many there's a greater attraction, there's a possible income, and in many of our communities the gangs have almost become an alternative government. I've got situations where people have their rent paid by gangsters, so they've almost created a separate, more powerful government. We've seen a lot of speculation that when it comes to the municipal elections which are coming, certain syndicates and gangsters actually planning to put up certain candidates, and some political parties, I would argue, and one in particular, has got very close links to the underworld. So dealing with that, I think it's one's really got to look at everything from whether decriminalization of drugs would not be one of the things that we need to consider, because that economy around the gangs essentially comes from the drugs, and whether we are able to put in place the systems to decriminalize. And I know that's a national issue, we need to look at it. But for me, it's about giving youth opportunities, trying to keep our young people in school until they matric, getting them into colleges, getting them into internships and artisanships, and creating role models, especially amongst men in our communities, is absolutely critical. But I think that remains the huge challenge. And then on rail, I think if we were able to get Shontshiloza Mail working as it used to about 8 or 10 years ago, it's actually, I would argue, a disgrace at the moment, the way that Shontshiloza Mail is operating, because many families were able to move up to Joburg and back, using that to literally tour our country. And for me, the link to the Northern Cape and the Eastern Cape is an issue. We've had Praza, was one of the main targets of state capture, and let's be honest, it's been hugely affected. But if we're able to strengthen rail, not only within the city, but between provinces, and that's the example I mentioned, that some people have raised the idea of a partnership between the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape on strengthening rail via Beaufort West, so that we can get there and come back. I think those are very, very good proposals which you've challenged the Premier and myself on. Thank you for that.
I'd like to say to the opposition that my name is Katrina Roberts. I failed to introduce myself. I actually had a very quick question. It's just gone. Thank you for that.
Okay, we'll move to closing remarks. Should we start with you, Cameron, or would you like the reverse process? You can speak for as long as you like now. I mentioned
that's quite a dangerous invitation. Like what I think you said in your briefing, 2 minutes.
Okay,
summary.
Speak for 2 minutes.
And I think just in summary, the debate that we were looking at is, should additional powers be devolved to provinces? And my basic argument is that we're a young democracy. We're trying to build provinces which were created out of Bantustans, which were basically very incapacitated governments which were not able to perform. They had to be integrated into provinces, and there's a huge amount of work that has to be done there, building capable provincial governments across the country. So when we talk about more powers to provinces, I think it links to the point that Anthony Butler made around, you're not just dealing with the Gauteng and Western Cape dealing with the other. Secondly, I think in terms of solving problems, that rather than calling for more additional powers, I think it's a question of looking at the legislation that we have, looking at creating the possibility for powers to be performed by municipalities or provinces if they can show a particular competence to do that. That doesn't necessarily require a constitutional change. And that thirdly, I think there are examples where the current arrangement has allowed different provinces to pass provincial legislation. 2 provinces have their own constitutions. So I would argue that the current framework is neither federal nor strictly unitary, but suits the current phase of development that we are in. And I would argue that we need to be driven by an evidence-based approach. There are particular problems on the balance of evidence. If a better solution can be found, let's find that solution rather than getting involved in debates which might take years to materialize in terms of constitutional majorities required to change the constitution and so on. We need to look at practical intergovernmental cooperative solutions to dealing with these issues. And I think be very frank to call out the corruption that exists and insist that each sphere of government needs to be run for the people through service delivery and with issues of accountability. And I think the electoral system discussion that is happening now could also be one way in which public representatives could be made more accountable if there is, as a constitutional court has held, an element of constituency-based or people standing on their own. So I think those are things which can strengthen our democracy. I just sometimes think that this debate is one which doesn't really focuses on us, on what is the problem and how to solve problems. It becomes quite an academic or a populist debate. And the successionist debate, I hear you having a speaker, I mean, it's a view and people should express it, but I think we actually to some extent waste time in discussing something which is actually unrealistic.
Right, thank you. Before we go on to the Premier, I'm just going to say thank you for both of you for very gentlemanly and cerebral interaction. I don't think we had any heated moments. So thank you all for being here, but the last few words for 2 minutes will be the Premier's, and then thank you.
Donald, I'm not finished yet.
Right.
Now I'm going to start. Thank you very much. I think I'm going to say that I do believe that those provinces that can have more power and can deliver more power, that's what we've got to get to. We've got to give that power to the provinces that are able to. And I understand there are provinces that are not able to. We've got to then put focus on those provinces to fix them. You know, it's the old adage is if the tire's flat, pump up the tire, don't let down the other tires. And we really have to let the provinces fly that can. I'm a proud South African. I am a Democrat, and I believe that we've got to do whatever we can when we put up our hands to say we will become part of finding solutions to build a better South Africa. I think that my own history in our parliament is a shared history between the Honourable Leader of the Opposition and myself. Cameron and I have served in various capacities. I've been the Chief Whip of the Opposition when he was in government at one stage, and now he's the opposition and I'm the Premier. But as I'm sure he does, I am a true Democrat, and I believe that whatever we do in the interests of building a better South Africa. And interesting, I think we probably few and far between in other parliaments. I don't know how many parliaments have got that kind of relationship. The discussion we were having at the table before we started is how are our daughters doing, because while we were on opposite sides of the House in Parliament, both of our daughters were in the same matric class together. I'm not sure what it was like teaching them or what their discussions were like when they had political discussions, but it must have been interesting. But I want to thank each and every one of you for giving up your time today. I want to thank the Press Club for putting this together, because if we are to build a better South Africa, these are the kind of debates we have to have. Not screaming and shouting at each other as we normally do in the legislature. It's about using these kinds of opportunities to find a better pathway so that we build a better opportunity for our daughters, but your children and your grandchildren.
On that note, what more can one say? Thank you all.